Hi, thanks for downloading The Inquiry from the BBC World Service. We're a weekly program. Our job is to add in-depth analysis to one question from the news. We hope you like it.
BBC World Service. This is Helena Merriman with The Inquiry. This week, is the Nigerian army failing? In the early hours of Sunday the 26th of January, Boko Haram gunmen attacked the town of Monguno in northeastern Nigeria. They set houses on fire, abducted women and children, and killed scores of civilians. The Nigerian military fought back, but were soon outgunned and overwhelmed. The insurgents took the city. The soldiers then fled to Maiduguri, the main city in the northeast, only to find that it, too, was under attack.
Around midnight, then we started hearing some gunshots, heavy gunshots.
This man was there.
So people started running away. There were fighter jets. They were going up and down, and the military were firing heavy guns towards where the insurgents were attacking Maiduguri.
The army fought back with ground troops and airstrikes, repelling the insurgents. But only 30 kilometres away, Boko Haram insurgents were descending on a third city, Konduga. It was a daring three-pronged attack. By the end of the day, Boko Haram was in control of most of the roads leading to Maiduguri, the city it planned to make the capital of its caliphate. Here was yet another embarrassment for the army, which has been unable to contain the insurgency. Since Boko Haram launched military attacks 6 years ago to create an Islamic State, the president, Goodluck Jonathan, says they've killed more than 13,000 people. They've seized vast swathes of territory too, now controlling an area the size of Belgium. So this week, we want to know, is the Nigerian army failing?
Part 1. Mutiny.
We once had an army that we're all proud of, but there's a lot of work to be done now for the armed forces to restore their lost glory.
This is Femi Falana, one of Nigeria's top human rights lawyers. He's well known for taking on poor and disadvantaged clients that now include a particular group of soldiers from the 7th Division in Maiduguri, that key town in the northeast.
These are young men whose ages range between 21 and 24, averagely. They joined the army with little or no training. They were railroaded to the battlefront without arms and ammunition, adequate weapons.
This particular group of soldiers is unique in one respect. They're all facing death by firing squad after being convicted in a military court of mutiny. Femi Falana says that what happened in those mutinies tells a story about why the army is failing.
Well, what happened was that the general officer commanding the 7th Division had a lot of complaints lodged by the soldiers, complaints of lack of payment of their salary and operational allowances, lack of adequate weapons, and general neglect, which were not attended to.
On the 14th of May last year, the dead bodies of 10 soldiers killed fighting Boko Haram were brought back to the camp. This lit a fuse.
The immediate cause was the fact that the dead bodies, corpses of 10 soldiers who had been killed in what the soldiers believed were avoidable circumstances. That infuriated the soldiers, and that led to the revolt. That unfortunate incident coincided with the visit of the GOC, that is the General Officer Commanding. The soldiers protested and shot at his car. The authorities decided to charge them for mutiny. Of course, they were tried and convicted and sentenced to death.
Then, just a few months later, the army had a more serious mutiny on its hands. It started after Boko Haram invaded a military camp.
In this instance, on the 9th of July, the Boko Haram sect invaded the camp of SF-11 Battalion. 3 officers and 23 soldiers were killed, while 82 were badly wounded. Their commanding officer did assure them that he was no longer going to send them to the battlefront without adequate weapons. Barely 3 weeks later, he asked them to confront the Boko Haram sect,
reminding him of his promise not to send them into battle without adequate weapons. Some soldiers refused to go. So the commander just took those soldiers who were willing to fight. The result? They were outgunned and captured.
A week later, the authorities in Maiduguri now sent weapons to the same soldiers who had refused to fight. They now picked the weapons and went to the battlefront, dislodged the Boko Haram sect, and extricated their officer and all the other soldiers who had been captured.
So the soldiers did go and fight in the end?
The soldiers that had refused to fight now got weapons and fought gallantly.
And then when they got back to their base,
they were arrested and charged before a court-martial for mutiny.
70 Nigerian soldiers are now facing death by firing squad. Mr. Helena is appealing against their sentence. But the army's troubles don't end here. It's also dismissed soldiers, hundreds of them, for disobeying orders. Here's one of those soldiers.
I feel cheated. I feel insulted. I feel embarrassed. I feel humiliated. It's just like 2 people that are fighting now, sir. You want to fight with me? Maybe we both have gun in our hands. But you are wearing bulletproof. Me, I'm carrying an umbrella. So how do you see it? Somebody with a bulletproof and somebody with umbrella. Who is more effective?
March 14th.
Meanwhile, outside military bases, army wives have been protesting. For 5 years, our husbands have been fighting Boko Haram, this woman says, with no visible results. We are tired.
The morale of the troops is extremely low.
Here's Femi Falana again.
The soldiers that have been killed while fighting, they are buried in shallow, unmarked graves. And that is not encouraging. And if you are going to encourage soldiers to fight, you must treat them like human beings.
But even if morale is low and soldiers don't have adequate weapons, does that justify mutiny and soldiers shooting at their commanders in a time of war?
I believe there should be discipline, even in the armed forces. But you have to look at the circumstances of every given case. If you are sentencing people on account of the negligence of the government in not making weapons available and your soldiers are unable to fight, you don't punish the soldier. You turn to the authorities to provide the enablement. If the soldiers have the weapons, they now refuse to fight. Of course, that is a very serious offense.
So, is the army failing? With mutinies, orders being disobeyed, and the growing strength of Boko Haram, it sounds like an open and shut case. So what do those responsible for Nigeria's security say? Meet our second expert witness.
Part 2. Take a wider view.
I don't see it as failing.
This is Sambo Dasuki, Nigeria's national security advisor. He came to the BBC studio, flanked by an entourage befitting a man who is both a prince and a former colonel in the army, now advising the president on how to defeat the insurgency.
Most of the problems are under the charge of 7th Division. They bear the brunt of most of what is unleashed by Boko Haram.
What are the sort of the challenges facing someone who is in the 7th Division?
You are literally on alert 24 hours a day, which is not easy. You can only do it for so long before things start going wrong. But that is unfortunately the situation they're in.
So it's very stressful.
It is stressful, yes. If you look at other insurgencies around the world, and how long they've lasted, how much damage they've done, and how some of them are still raging 50 years later. You won't say they failed. It's a new phenomenon they're faced with, and they're adopting not as fast as we would want, but they're adapting to the new challenge that they are facing.
He has a point. Even for the strongest army in the world, defending such a huge swathe of territory against a nimble, radical insurgent group would pose major challenges. But shouldn't an army in the country with the largest economy in Africa be able to do more to contain the group?
We've had issues. We've had issues of 1, personnel, and 2, of equipment, 3, of cooperation or involvement of the neighboring countries. We've been able to have all these come in place now, and better late than never.
When you say personnel problems, what do you mean by that?
Personnel being the military men we had. The quality of some of the soldiers was not what you would want to go into any sort of operation with.
Is that because of lack of training?
You could say that lack of training, and also a lack of commitment on the part of some of those who joined the army simply because they were looking for jobs, not because they were interested in careers in the military. So there will be something like that. A lot of us who served in the military are not very proud of some of the things we see.
Such as?
Well, you don't expect the Nigerian soldier to run. He's never been known to run anywhere.
He's referring to widespread reports of Nigerian soldiers tearing off their uniforms, running away from Boko Haram fighters. And then, of course, there are those mutinies.
For soldiers to mutiny is a very serious thing. The military depends solely on discipline, strict discipline, for survival. And mutiny is an indication of a complete breakdown of that discipline. So it was a very unfortunate thing and very disappointing and distressing.
And what will happen to those soldiers who are court-martialed?
The military law is clear. Those of them who are condemned to death will go through the appeal process. At the end of the day, the president decides whether to approve.
So there could be executions?
There could be executions, yes. You know what the punishment is. It's like getting involved in a military coup d'etat. If it fails, you know you're going to be tied to a stake. There's no point in attempting a coup, failing, and then pleading, please let me off. You knew what the punishment was from the beginning. It's the same thing with the mutiny. The punishment is obvious.
But, as we heard from our first expert witness, the human rights lawyer, soldiers say they're outgunned. In one interview, a soldier complained that his platoon only had AK-47s, while Boko Haram had anti-aircraft guns mounted on four-wheel drives.
The basic weapon of the soldier is that rifle. And the AK-47 is not just only AK-47. But even that I dispute. Boko Haram did videos of equipment they seized from the Nigerian military.
In the video, the camera pans around a huge arsenal of weapons. Dozens of AK-47s lined up in neat rows. Machine guns, mortar launchers and boxes of ammunition, all captured, the person in the video says, from Nigerian military bases.
Now, anybody who's seen the amount of equipment they've displayed as having been seized from the Nigerian military will not agree that the soldiers were outgunned or ill-equipped. I think it's an imagination. I chalk it down to somebody who's a coward, who's looking for excuses, and that is what it is.
So you're saying the army has all the guns it needs, it doesn't need any more?
No, I didn't say that. I'm saying they have sufficient to confront the threat as it is.
Do you think, though, that if you had more advanced weapons, perhaps weapons that you buy from the West, could that help?
Certainly it would help. It is an issue, which was why we made attempts before to procure, and we hit brick walls here and there, but we have to look for alternatives and make do with what we can get.
It's a conflicted answer. He says that soldiers have enough weapons to defeat Boko Haram, so they have no excuse to mutiny. But then he also says they need weapons from the West. So why aren't Nigeria's allies, the US and the UK, stepping in, selling Nigeria more sophisticated hardware?
There were all sorts of excuses. All of a sudden, there was an issue of our human rights records. Well, if you are measuring my human rights records against somebody who lines up people and slits their throats or sends kids to blow themselves up, I don't know what sort of standards you're using.
Human rights groups say that some members of the Nigerian military have been slitting throats of detainees and then dumping them in mass graves. The Nigerian authorities say they're investigating. In the meantime, both the British and the US governments have decided not to sell arms to Nigeria. But is this the right decision? Here's our third expert witness.
Part 3. Is the Army failing? A systems check.
My name's Colonel James Hall. I'm a retired officer.
You can still hear the vestiges of the military in his voice, but Colonel James Hall is now enjoying retirement in the Hebrides off the west coast of Scotland, a long way from Nigeria, where he spent the last 3 years of his career advising the military.
There are massive challenges facing them, and if one just gets sanctimonious and preaches to them, then they justifiably get pretty fed up, particularly in the military, because they are dying in large numbers. Now, that is not to say that the military are doing a good job, because I don't think anybody reasonably could argue that they are. They've got it badly wrong. Boko Haram has made significant strides against them. Over the 4 or 5 years I've been watching it, things have got worse rather than better.
He thinks that the West should be doing more to support the Nigerian military.
The UK needs to think about this really hard, and I personally think that we have been overprotective. We can only get ourselves back into a position where the Nigerians can govern their own space if there is the use of some pretty significant physical violence against Boko Haram in the first place. And at the moment, the Nigerian military are not showing that they can do that.
He says there's one key reason for this.
Their equipment is old, it's broken, it's frankly not well maintained, and soldiers, men with rifles, are standing on the ground facing Boko Haram with exactly the same weapon systems as they have themselves. You have platoon commanders in isolated posts who are trying to communicate with company headquarters and battalion headquarters by mobile phones, and given that the mobile phone networks up there have periodically been switched off, that's not great, so they can't do much when they come under attack. So if I had my way, I would be giving them pickup trucks, light armoured vehicles and radios.
But why are there such problems with equipment, given that 20% of Nigeria's budget goes on its security services? That's $6 billion a year. Granted, not all of that goes to the military. Some of it goes to the police. But still, it's a lot of money.
It's a fair question, and the answer to it is not transparent. One can speculate, and of course everybody will start talking about corruption, Nigerians as much as outsiders, and there is no doubt at all that the systems of procurement over the years have been subject to pretty serious levels of corruption.
So lack of equipment and corruption are two reasons why the army is failing. But he says another problem is the kind of training that goes on in the Nigerian military.
Whilst the military takes its academic education very seriously for its officers, their tactical training is not as good as they think it is. Their troops need combat training. How do I cope and manage when I'm in a firefight? Those are classic military skills, and let's be quite clear, all the rumours say that they are getting that training increasingly from people like the Russians, and frankly that has to be a good thing. We shouldn't be forcing people to go and fight untrained.
Given the scale of these problems, Colonel Hall says that he's not surprised that some soldiers are refusing to fight.
My experience of the Nigerian Armed Forces, all three services, is that in fact they are an immensely disciplined force. I don't think I've ever come across an African army that has a clearer sense of discipline at all ranks. And actually, in that sense, they would challenge any Western army, I think. Does military discipline break down under pressure? Yes, of course it does. And troops that are under real pressure, frightened, dying, feeling abandoned, their discipline can break.
So, is Nigeria's army failing? We've heard that it's struggling to contain Boko Haram because of inadequate equipment, inappropriate training and low morale. And its human rights record means that Western allies are wary about selling it advanced weapons. But these reasons in themselves don't explain why things have got this bad. After all, the army wasn't always like this.
There was a time when it was, without a shadow of a doubt, the best trained and probably one of the best equipped of the sub-Saharan African armed forces.
So what went wrong? The irony is, the military itself is partly to blame.
Military governments, as is surprisingly quite common in world history, are often not good at funding their own militaries. So the modern military out there are very conscious of the fact that actually they didn't do terribly well out of military government. They were left a lot weaker than they should have been.
Between Nigerian independence in 1960 and the last military government in 1999, there were only 10 years of civilian government, but 30 of military rule, punctuated by regular coups. Femi Falana, the human rights lawyer, says that it was for fear of being toppled that military leaders kept the army weak.
Over the years, the armed forces were neglected by successive governments for fear of possible coup d'etats. The government have not been buying the necessary weapons for the armed forces.
And the memory of those coups remains vivid for those in power now. Sambo Dasuki, the National Security Advisor we heard from earlier, took part in the coup that removed former military leader Muhammad Buhari in 1985. But even he admits that military rule has damaged the army.
Over time, military being in government doesn't help much. It does affect issues of discipline and morale, and that is probably one of the things that led to the army or the military finding itself with this level of poor state of equipment. The main preoccupation of any military administration is self-preservation, and your greatest threat is the military. Now, if they don't have equipment to remove you, they won't remove you. It makes it a little more difficult for them to remove you if they're only going to run around with AK-47s. And that is unfortunately what they ended up with.
So it was in the interest of the military to not allow soldiers to become too powerful?
It was in the interest of the military leaders, yes.
All eyes are now on Nigeria's forthcoming elections. The incumbent, Goodluck Jonathan, is fighting a close race against former military leader Muhammad Buhari. Yes, that same leader who was toppled by a military coup. The future of the army may then depend on the following calculation. The next president deciding that the benefits of an army that can defeat an insurgency outweigh the risks of that army one day overthrowing him.
The Inquiry is produced in London by Simon Mabon and me, Neil Rizal.